We have big news, maybe, in the case of the death of Trump friend and sex trafficker Jeffrey Epstein, who died under what I admit are strange and unusual circumstances while in jail awaiting trial in what was called a suicide. But quite frankly, it sounded odd from day one, even without jumping into any particular conspiracy theory. The New York chief medical examiner ruled the death a suicide by hanging back in August. There is this well-known forensic pathologist named Michael Baden, who's been appearing on television for decades. I remember watching him on Larry King when I was a kid in the late 90s. And he was interviewed by the folks over at Fox and Friends. And he says the evidence that he has reviewed is more indicative of homicide than suicide. Now, I want to look at pieces of this because while I agree that there are weird things about the Epstein death, I'm going to be totally transparent with you. I'm not fully in on the conspiracy theory side. I'm not fully in on the official story makes sense to me. I don't know what happened, but I want us to be savvy and critical consumers of any assertion that we see in the media. And there is a lot of stuff here that, if you actually pick it apart, doesn't make a lot of sense. So let's start with the first segment from Fox and Friends.
Well, I was asked by the brother, the next of kin, to be at the autopsy. And at the autopsy on day one, there were findings that were unusual for suicidal hanging and more consistent with ligature homicidal strangulation, which included...
And it was suggested at the time that he committed suicide by doing what?
By hanging. At the time, he was found allegedly hanging by a homemade ligature of sheets.
Are you saying you don't think it was suicide?
I think that the evidence points toward homicide rather than suicide.
Why?
Because there are multiple 3 fractures in the hyoid bone, the thyroid cartilage, that are very unusual for suicide and more indicative of strangulation, homicidal strangulation.
So Baden says that the autopsy he observed, it was inconclusive whether it was homicide or suicide initially, and then it was later changed, and it's unclear why. And that's a lot of the focus here, but that's not really evidence of anything, and it's important to understand that. Also, a lot of the framing of this interview is off. Brian Kilmeade frames this like Baden is like working a charity case here. He says, "How did you learn the family needed your help?" It's important to understand that Michael Baden was hired by Jeffrey Epstein's brother. He's in the employ of Jeffrey Epstein. This is not a charity case. And your entire understanding of what Michael Baden says is different if you see him as the Good Samaritan with decades of expertise showing up to help out someone in need versus he's involved because he was hired for money, presumably, as far as we would be led to assume, by one of the parties that is involved. You have to take that into account. Let's continue.
So you're saying when you left the examination room, they weren't sure what happened.
That's right.
So what, you know this procedure, what happened in the interim to get this such a blunt conclusion?
Well, a week later, it was changed to homicide. The brother wants to know, what did they get new in that week to make it homicide?
What's your answer to that?
We don't know. We don't know. It's 80 days now.
Right.
And the brother feels he's getting a runaround. And to add to it, there was a total breakdown in security. The video cameras didn't work. The guards went to sleep.
Okay, and then, so this is sort of a key thing. These broken bones are much at issue, and later he's asked if he's ever seen fractured bones in the hyoid or thyroid. I think with the thyroid, it's called something else, maybe a fracture or a damage to it, in a self-inflicted hanging death.
How hard is it to commit suicide in prison?
Very easy. But first, in this situation, if he took the sheets and stripped it, it would have taken a good half hour or hour to make the ligature, then to go up there. Once you're hanging, it's about 5 minutes or so that you can be near dead.
Dr. Baden, though, if the supposition is that it was a homicide, that would mean cops were in on it. Who opened the door, who moved the cameras, all of that stuff.
Was it someone on the outside, or was it an inside job?
That's right. That's a terrible allegation.
Why were the two guards asleep? In 50 years of looking at deaths in New York State, and occasionally a guard falls asleep. Never are 2 guards at the same time. The cell, the camera in the cell watching didn't work. The camera in the hallway to see if anybody came in and out of his cell didn't work. This is bizarre that his roommate was taken away, so he's all by himself. Suicide watch was taken away. So yeah, the issue you bring up has to be investigated. Doesn't mean that this was a homicide, right, but certainly it deserves investigation. And the brother's concerned there is no investigation.
Have you ever seen anyone that committed suicide and was hanging themselves with those 3 broken bones?
No. Hanging does not cause these broken bones, and homicide does. Usually 2 bones, even 3, is a huge amount of pressures was applied.
So listen, I don't know what to think, okay? If we step back for a second, Michael Baden was hired by Epstein's brother, so that has to be taken into account here. Fox and Friends then has a further interest in perpetuating the most sensational and salacious possible version of the story. But at the same time, even people in our audience who are not prone to conspiratorial thinking email me every few days and say, David, something here doesn't seem right. There are too many coincidences. He was on suicide watch and then taken off. And then the cameras go down and the guards fall asleep and he ends up with broken bones that never get broken in a hanging suicide. But, and this is what we all should be doing, you've got to start looking at these claims one by one, because a lot of times, without taking a side, I want to be clear, I don't know what happened. A lot of times when you hear all these facts together, it's like, wow, yeah, that clearly something else happened. But you got to break them down one by one. An example. Baden says part of the suspicious thing is he was on suicide watch and then he was taken off of it. That's not really a part of the story. His own lawyers, Epstein's own lawyers, asked for him to be removed from suicide watch. Conditions are not as good in suicide watch when you are on suicide watch at this particular facility. So that's not really part of what we're looking at. His own lawyers said take him off of suicide watch. Then there's the claim. He says, I've never seen those bones broken in a suicide. Well, hold on a second. I did a very quick Googling and found a study called, and there's many of these, Fractures of the Hyoid Bone and Thyroid Cartilage in Suicidal Hanging, which says that in this study, in 25% of the cases reviewed, there were fractures of the hyoid bone in known hanging suicides. So when Michael Baden says, I've never seen this, well, here's a study that says it happens a quarter of the time. It's not proof of anything. But again, when he says he's never seen it and that feels overwhelming to us, and then we say, well, hold on, here's an actual peer-reviewed study which says it's not that rare. This one says it's happened in a quarter of the times. There are other studies which say it's even more common that you see fractures of the hyoid bone, even in a suicidal hanging. So I don't know what happened. I'm not purporting to tell you what happened. I have an open mind, and a lot of this does seem weird. And on motive, there are lots of people who would want Epstein dead. All I'm saying is when you hear the bullet points rattled off, camera, broken bones, suicide watch, it sounds overwhelming and uncontestable. But when you start breaking it down and looking at each piece one by one, a lot of these things can be crossed off. They can be crossed off as proof or disproof. They sort of become not particularly relevant factors. And then you maybe can get a more sober and sensible assessment of what went on. We may still never know what ultimately happened, but it's important to take every single assertion with the same skepticism that I hope I have inspired people to have about any messages we hear in media, including those you hear here on The David Pakman Show. Let me know what you think. I'm on Twitter @DPakman, and the show is on Twitter @David Pakman Show.